Welcome to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Video History Project. We're extremely fortunate today to be able to interview Dr. Lawrence Longo, better known as Larry, one of the premier developmental biologists in our specialty, one who has over 300 publications, one who has been one of the leaders in the field of development research and research in terms of how we are, what we are, and how our specialty has evolved. Larry, I want to welcome you, and I especially want to thank you for your willingness to share your life story with us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Let's begin, because I'd like to ask you a few questions, basically about your background. Where were you born?
I was born in Los Angeles, but I grew up in San Francisco, in the Bay Area.
So you're a California person all the time?
Much of the time.
Much of the time. Oh, I understand that. Where did you first go to school?
Well, I was in, right after I started college, I turned 18, and it was during World War II, and just a few weeks following my birthday, I was in a uniform here, in fact, here, I was inducted here in the city, and as all of us young men were going up to the table where this old sergeant was that was assigning people their duty, he looked at me and he said, "What do you do, kid?" And I said, "Well, I just started college." He said, "Yeah? What are you taking?" I said, "Well, I'm taking pre-med." He said, "Boom, you're going to be a medic."
Oh.
So that was
it.
My indoctrination, and not too long after that, I got shipped off to somewhere I didn't know where. I ended up in China, and this was during the latter part of World War II.
And where did you ultimately go to medical school?
At what then was called the College of Medical Evangelists, now Loma Linda University.
So you've been a long-time Loma Linda person.
Well, off and on.
Tell me,
Right.
When you were in medical school, did you envision that you would have a research career like you have had?
Not at all. No, it's all an accident, because I was planning on going into practice, and actually I wanted to go to Africa, which I did for 3 years, and try to save the world, which I didn't. And no, it was while I was I did my residency in OBGYN at USC, LA County Hospital, and it was during that time that I met some of the people at the then newly founded UCLA School of Medicine. And so I went out there and worked, and fell into the influence of Daniel Morton, one of the great people in our specialty who did much to inspire a number of us young people, Dan Michel, Fred Napthalen. I could go down a long list.
Dan was a marvelous person.
Great people. And then, because I felt I needed some basic training, basic science training, I went to the University of Pennsylvania to start, and then stayed on there. And to show how our specialty was regarded in those days, when I first met the man with whom I worked, Robert Forrester, who was later elected to the National Academy of Sciences, he consented to interview me. And then at the end he said, "Well, what field of medicine are you in?" And I said, "Well, I'm not in internal medicine. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist." And his jaw dropped, and he looked at me and he said, "My God, can you read and write?" And
I understand that impression.
but that was the impression that so many people had of our specialty. And unfortunately, I don't think it's totally dissipated.
What made you think to go into OBGYN? What factor influenced you?
As a medical student, it just seemed like such an exciting specialty from the standpoint that you were helping bring life into the world, and the patients were happy, and it just seemed like such a wonderful opportunity to help do something in medicine that was going to have a long-term benefit. Not that anything else isn't, but obstetrics just seemed such a wonderful and a challenge because at the time, one of the reasons I actually went into research is because when I was at LA County, as you know, as is today, a number of premature babies were ending up with brain damage. And so I thought, oh, if I can just spend a couple of years in research, I'll figure it all out, and we can stop this horror of these children being damaged. But it just a wonder, I can't imagine a more wonderful life.
Well, when you decided that you did want to dedicate yourself to research, were you still at UCLA or were you in?
No, I was at Penn.
You were at Penn.
And again, it was kind of an accident. I went there. I thought I'd spend a year or two and then go back maybe to UCLA and help practice. But the mentor under whom I worked, Daniel Morton, Daniel Morton at UCLA was stimulating, and then at Penn, Robert Forrester. And Forrester said, what are you going to do with your life, Longo? And I said, well, I want to practice this. He says, damn it, you've got to do research.
Tell me a little bit about your research experience at Penn. What exactly did you do?
The initial problems that I worked on, the mentor under whom I worked was the one who had put pulmonary diffusing capacity on the map. And I had this simple-minded idea that if I could just develop a way to measure the diffusing capacity of the placenta, that then we could get some handle on how babies were doing and which ones might be in trouble. And so the earliest experiments, we started doing work in sheep, and this was just at the time that Dr. Barron and his group had introduced chronic catheterization of the fetus so that we could do studies in the sheep and the fetus under quasi-physiologic conditions.
And what did you find?
Well, we found a lot of things. One of the exciting studies that we did was to ask the question of the resistance to diffusion across the placenta. How much was due to the hemoglobin reaction rates of oxygen jumping on and off hemoglobin versus how much was due to the diffusion barrier of the placenta, because again, at this time the idea was that because of studies earlier in Joseph Barcroft's laboratory that suggested that near term the oxygen tensions and oxyhemoglobin saturation in the baby's blood was dropping, and that, quotes, not only was the fetus at Mount Everest in utero, but that the baby's first breath was the fetus's dying gasp. And so the idea was to try to do that, to understand to what extent there really was a barrier to diffusion. And for those studies, we had to do work in a hyperbaric pressure chamber. And Penn was blessed, it still is, as having one of the best facilities in the world for doing hyperbaric research.
During that period of time, were you aware of the difference in fetal hemoglobin and maternal hemoglobin?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Did that have an impact on the diffusion?
We checked that. That's an interesting question. And actually I collaborated with a biochemist of hemoglobin to look at the reaction rates and found that they were the same.
And you must have been one of the first ones really studying the so-called placental barrier.
Well,
because they really weren't studying it, they were just stating it was there at that time.
We were trying to study it.
Yeah. What was your next major project?
Because of my interest in brain damage in children, much of my work over the years, and some of it continues to be on trying to understand the regulation of blood flow to the brain in the fetus and the newborn infant, and specifically, why is it that the newborn, the premature newborn particularly, is so vulnerable to intracerebral hemorrhage, germinal matrix hemorrhage, intraventricular bleeds. And so a lot of the work we've done has been continually at a deeper level trying to understand those so-called signal transduction mechanisms, from receptor-mediated calcium fluxes to what's going on with the various protein kinases, Rho kinase, extracellular regulated kinases in both the calcium-dependent and calcium-independent pathways. And we're still a long ways from really understanding it, but one of the fascinating points, I believe, is how in the developing fetus and the newborn infant, the signal transduction mechanisms in the cerebral vasculature are very different from those in the mature adult, which we take as the gold standard. And we've just published several papers recently in the American Journal of Physiology on important aspects of these differences. The idea being that if we can really get this sorted out, perhaps there'll be a way that one can use molecular therapy, gene therapy, stem cell therapy in these markedly premature infants to prevent some of these invidious consequences of dysregulation of blood flow.
Are you still doing some of this work in sheep? Or
some of it, that part of it is in sheep. The other side of my brain, we've gotten interested in the problem of so-called epigenetics, prenatal influences on not just fetal development and that of the newborn, but the development in later life of hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and that work is all in mice. But again, it's terribly exciting. That's why I don't quit.
Well, I can understand that. How many young researchers do you have working with you?
Well, our group now, we have 12 faculty in our Center for Perinatal Biology, and each, although I'm still the director, against my will, each one runs their own group, gets their own NIH grants and funding from other agencies. And so with their pre-docs and post-docs and other people, there are close to 50 people in the group.
You said something earlier about the fact that a lot of people don't really look at OBGYNs as researchers. But I know that you've had a big part in trying to change that impression. And one of them was the Research Scientist Development Program, which I don't think anyone would disagree is your baby.
Well, thank you.
What made you come up with that idea?
Well, I think we started the Reproductive Science Development Program in the late 1980s, and previous to that, I had been working on a report for the Institute of Medicine. I'm not a member of that body, but a report on the history of research in obstetrics and gynecology, which they published in one of their reports. And it became apparent to me that in contrast with many other specialties in medicine, our field was falling behind, or was never in the ballgame, so to speak, as far as NIH funding or anything else. And so at a meeting of the American Gynecological Society at Warm Springs, which I'm sure you've been to many times, a group of us, Bob Jaffe, Fred Naphthalin, Jim Warren, and several of us met to discuss what we could do, and the consensus was that we should asked the NIH if they would help us develop a program that could help educate young people in obstetrics and gynecology in really hardcore basic science, cell and molecular biology. And because the other members of the group were all departmental chairmen, and they looked at me and said, well, Longo, you don't have anything to do. You write this application and fight it out. And so the two people that I regard as being most instrumental, one was Warren Pierce, your predecessor as executive director. Warren was an enormous help, morally support, and actually getting some of the bodies to help support. And then the other was Dwayne Alexander, who was at then and until recently director of the National Institute of Child Health. And Dr. Alexander was supportive of the idea of having such a program, but he said, Longo, he said, I want to be frank with you, the NIH isn't going to support this unless you get support from some other professional groups or corporations, pharmaceutical companies, anywhere, I don't care where, but you've got to get outside support. So then I spent almost 2 years going hand in hand to different professional organizations within the specialty, seeing if they would help support this idea. And it's interesting, coming back to that comment earlier about the problems with our specialty in research, how many people thought that, you know, Longo, you're crazy. This is, why would we want to have obstetricians that know anything about basic science? Let the PhDs do that. And in fact, even after we submitted the proposal, that we had to go to Washington, to Bethesda, for a reverse site visit to try to defend the proposal to the review group. Several on the review committee said, Longo, you're nuts. Obstetrician ought to be out delivering babies, not trying to do basic science and research. Leave that to other people. So it's been an interesting journey.
That is amazing to me, that we would turn down something which is the core of medicine.
Well, I was very happy. As I walked up here this afternoon, I ran into John Ye, who was the chairman at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and now is at the New England Deaconess, was one of our first scholars in the reproductive science program, and an outstanding young man. And it's because I just had to do the renewal to the NIH for this grant, which Bob Jaffe runs it now out of UC San Francisco, but I still help do some of the paperwork on grant writing and renewals. And it's amazing to see the number of wonderful young people that have gone through the program and are actually leaders in our specialty.
And not only leaders, doing excellent research. I know at the college we support it. We put about $120,000 a year in.
Oh.
And I think that's still not enough.
Well, I have to tell you that, as I say, beginning with Warren Pierce, who to me is in the pantheon of the gods, and you too. Yeah. This has been, but this is what's made it work. Because you've had that vision of appreciating that, yes, clinical practice is one of the most important things we can do, but we still have to explore the frontiers. There's so many challenges in our specialty that we have to try to explore.
Where we're going to go next, I would say otherwise we'd still be bleeding patients in order to cure them if we didn't do research. Speaking about that, tell me about how you developed such an interest in the history of our specialty.
Well, I think part of it started when I graduated from medical school somebody gave me a copy of William Osler's essay, A Way of Life. And because I was an intern at USC, LA County, I didn't have a lot of time to read, but sometimes when I was on call at night and things were a little quiet, I'd read, and I was so struck with that. And then I went and got Harvey Cushing's Life of William Osler, which was published in 1925, and as you know, won a Pulitzer Prize in biography.
And I have a copy.
And that kind of changed my life.
So you've been collecting these books for many years.
Yeah, I started as a resident. I had a friend who was he became a friend who was quite a famous rare book dealer in Los Angeles, and he started helping me and saying, "Oh, Longo, you got to have this book. And, you don't have to pay for it now, just when you can." And so I kind of got seduced in a way, but it was great. And yes, I have a fair collection. It's actually going to the Huntington Library now, most of it, although some is coming to your college library.
We share a very mutual interest in that, because I think if we don't preserve our history, then we're not going to be better off than the cavemen.
Well, and it's such an exciting history.
It is.
Such a rich history. It goes back so far. And you think of the people in the 16th and 17th century, the hunters and other people that did so much to advance our field. It's just a beautiful, rich history.
Yes, it is. And it's an ongoing history.
Right.
It's one, very pleased that you did it. I understand you're giving the lecture at this ACM, the history
Yes.
lecture.
Yes.
One of the things that I'm most pleased about is that we now have a history lecture at our annual clinical
I
meeting.
think that's a great tribute to the society that you would do that, because, well, as George Sandiana said, those that don't remember history can't deal with the present. He said it more eloquently than that.
I know the quote.
But yeah, I think it's, again, it's just such a, to me, so, such evidence of the maturity of the college that you would support such a historical lecture.
Let me take you back. You were talking about young people in research. How would you advise a young medical student interested in OBGYN that had a research interest? What would you recommend to that person?
Well, I'm probably biased. I think if I had it to do all over again, I would have done a combined MD, PhD degree and really gotten the hardcore training in cell and molecular biology as I was going along. But I wasn't smart enough when I was a medical student or resident to know that. And I think that would be useful, but again, there's so many challenges, whether it's, to me, some of the big challenges in our specialty are so enormous: premature labor, all this brain damage in premature babies, the whole business of epigenetics and what prenatal diet or drug use or a lot of other things are having an effect on the growing fetus, not just during fetal or newborn life, but as an adult. And then, we can go down the laundry list, so to speak, of cancer or reproductive problems. There's so many challenges in our specialty that are just crying for attention and crying for bright young minds to try to attack them and solve them. That I think it's just such a glorious opportunity.
You've identified a number of very critical problems. What do you see as the one major problem that we need to try to solve next? I know you're working on the brain damage infant and everything, but Other than what you're doing, what would you say would be our one most pressing issue?
Well, having spent 3 years in Africa trying to save the world and didn't, I think a big issue is maternal and child health throughout the world, and the tremendous problems in maternal mortality in developing countries, the lack of just simple measures that can help save lives, clean water, sanitation, and the challenge we have is a specialty in trying to improve maternal and child health throughout the world.
We still have problems here in our own country. I noticed there's a recent very interesting report out of California about the increase in maternal mortality in California.
Yes.
You think we're entering into a time when we're beginning to forget what's happening at home and being much more focused on lesser important things?
Well, I'm not sure you want me to get into the political realm of problems such as the whole NIH budget for a year equals 17 or 18 days of the Iraq War. If you're thinking of those kinds of perspectives, which I find deeply troubling, particularly because of the manner in which much of this is conducted in the taking of lives. But I feel again that I don't mean to repeat myself, but that the challenges we have in our specialty are just so enormous, whether they're at home here in the US or overseas, and at almost any aspect of the various subspecialties or compartmentalization that are just so enormous. And I just wish I could wave a magic wand and get a lot of more bright young people interested in research as a way to contribute to the specialty.
I wouldn't have asked you the question if I didn't feel pretty much the same way you did. And I thought you probably would say the same thing. I do think it's terrible that we could do so much if we weren't diverting money to what less than appropriate areas.
It's just obscene. Right.
Larry, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it's been such a wonderful
It's been
pleasure.
I thank you so much for coming back. No, this is the second time. This is Larry Longo Part 2. But you've had such a marvelous career.
I've been blessed. I've been lucky. It's such an exciting specialty and such an exciting way of life. I couldn't have wished for anything better. I just wish I'd done more things that were important.
Oh, you've done so much. I mean, the things that you've done to make research living and upfront and people to think about it in our specialty, that it goes beyond measure and as to how important it is.
You're overly generous.
No, I'm not overly generous. I'm just really speaking what most people think. You're really one of our most important people, and I thank you very much for coming for an interview again.
Well, thank you.
It's a real pleasure talking to you.
This is great.
Thank you very much.
This is a great privilege. Thank you.